Good morning. In this lesson, I want to look at the power of literary characters in literature and in the Bible to influence and shape our lives. Literature and the narratives that we read and share and talk about are very powerful, and they can shape our lives and the lives of others around us. There are important literary stories and literatures that we accept in our culture that we share with one another. From when we're young, we tell stories about one another and about our lives, and these shape our aspirations and hopes. Sometimes they're too big, sometimes they're too small. And part of the journey of life challenge is to adjust our expectations to fit in with realities, true stories that can fit with our lives. Literature and the characters that we talk about connect us in time and to past realities in the past that we value, also future hopes, and the ways in which we value certain objects or ideas or ideologies in the present reality, the way we value certain worldviews, views of the world in the present. Literatures and stories that we tell one another connect us to one another as well in community. And if we tell a story such as this is a good salary, this is work that's valuable, this is the work that we're interested in doing, this is important, then our lives and our identity will often be strongly shaped by our commitments to this work, this identity, and the stories that we tell about the value and tasks of the work that we do. For instance, in farming, a farmer will have a view of their tasks and how long to put in and what they're doing and the value of it. The stories they tell will shape what they know and do and are committed to in farming, similar to in mining or a car mechanic or other occupations that are seen as important. Others are influenced by communities around them and cultures to have different views on the narratives and stories that they tell and the activities that they are involved in. And so too, we see parenting, there can be different views on this and different values, and there can be stories told that reinforce the values that people have with all of these activities. Some see exercise and sport and dieting as important, and there can be stories that we tell to reinforce this, and there can be characters that we look to who are the heroes that we speak of and share about. Often it's the value that people and groups place on objects, ideas, and stories and activities that we tell shape the sense of their importance to us. And whether you're a believer, you've got stories that shape and connect to God, or an atheist, you've got other stories that give value to your life and what you see in life as being important. Religion is one of the strongest drivers that people have towards a sense of purpose and meaning in life and ways in which that connects to their life. But it's not the only driver of meaning. Others look to sport or relationships or families, self-achievement. Business too can contribute strongly to a sense of meaning and identity. But in this subject, we're wanting to talk about Bible and literature and religion, and it's religion that often takes up one of the strongest and largest ways of connecting with a sense of identity, a connection with history in the past and eternity and hopes in the eternal future. Often religion can be very strong in connecting with deep ideals, deeper understandings of people and personality and freedom and agency. That's not the only one. I'm very interested in phenomenology as a way of accepting and understanding and engaging with the phenomena that people experience. And many phenomenologists would say, God may be there. I just spoke to him. I heard him speak back. In cultures around us, it's the phenomena that people experience. And we call this phenomenology, the study of the phenomena as people experience them, rather than looking more objectively at that which can be measured or weighed or spoken more objectively of in terms of the material realm in which we live. In the book, The Character of God, Recovering Lost Literary Power of American Protestant, Thomas Jenkins writes, literature could convey many things, scenery, customs, and so on. And we could read the Bible for many reasons. But the crucial test of a writer's skill, says Jenkins, is their ability to depict character. It's often character that most shapes a narrative and story and leads it forward, that catches our attention, that most challenges us to go on reading because we have a sense of identification with the character. And in this week 3 of our studies, we're going to look at the character of Moses as the driving character of the book of Exodus. And we're going to think about the ways in which the character of Moses continues to challenge us and speak to us many centuries, many millennia later. Robert Louis Dabney says, to draw an imaginary man like nature in his feelings and conduct is one of the hardest tasks of literary genius. And today we're going to look at scripture and the ways in which different characters are depicted to us, such as Moses. It's also a task in drawing a character that promises the biggest impact in a story. It's widely assumed that literature not only is a guide to character, but it can influence character. And so the characters we read about and aspire to, whether it be Batman or Superman, or whether it be others that your family tell you about as someone to look up to and aspire to be like, can often have a huge influence on us. Solomon Bush, a Unitarian minister, once said, character has great influence, whether bodied forth in ideal creations or exhibited in actual life. Character can have a huge influence, whether it be a real character or a character that's talked about. And many of the characters in our reading or our viewing of television or other media have become so real to us that these are often seen as actual people, no longer actors, and at times even more real than the flesh and blood people around us. Often it's the characters that are presented to us in various media that can influence our thinking, our actions, our aspirations, our beliefs, our plans in life. And you might want to take a moment now to think about some of the characters and people that have most influenced your life journey, and what is it about them, and what is it about the way in which their life story has been communicated to you, and the various other proverbs and insights that they've passed on, the wisdom that they've passed on, and the way it has influenced you. You might want to write down some of these major influences on your life in terms of real people, in terms of people that you've read about, in terms of various stories and narratives that have influenced your life, who you aspire to be. I remember reading about great scientists when I was younger, and this inspired me to do a bachelor degree in science. Other times I read about great preachers and missionaries, and that inspired me in becoming a pastor and being involved in the church. And I've also remember reading about the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, and that too inspired my life journey. I remember my grandparents encouraged me, gave me a book about Florence Nightingale, and that nurtured an interest in medicine, seeing all that she'd done. There's many characters that are presented to us in the stories that we read, and the real lived out stories of the people around us that influence us through our life journey. James K.A. Smith challenges the teaching and pedagogies aimed primarily just at the mind and cognitive abilities. And you need to do this for a certain reason. Smith says the correct thinking alone is not sufficient to guide our actions, our behavior, our character formation. Smith says that in light of the biblical anthropology that's presented in the Bible, through the characters and through the narratives and stories that are presented to us, human beings are much more than rational minds. And the authors of the Bible are doing more than just communicate information. They're writing in ways that challenge us to think. And often fraught with background or lack of background, some of the stories are written in ways that challenge us to think more deeply about what is being presented. And a lot of good literature doesn't say such and such is a good character. They leave it to us to think through whether this person is a good character or not. And rather than a flat character that's just two-dimensional, a well-developed, well-rounded character in biblical literature will say their strengths and weaknesses. And so we're left on edge a bit to think, what will this character do? And certainly Moses in Exodus is presented as such a character who, in his younger years, and in chapter 2 of Exodus, we read has some weaknesses and some failings. You might want to stop and read chapter 2 account of Moses there and see the way in which Moses wrestles with challenges and difficulties through his life journey. And we resonate and identify with this well-rounded description of character as having both strengths and weaknesses. The formation of character plays an indispensable role if we're to move beyond a rhetoric of preparing students and one another just for career, but preparing people for calling, for being, for fully engaging with life and opportunities. We need to encourage people not only to develop in terms of their thinking, but also to develop in terms of their hearts and character. James K.A. Smith draws on insights from Aristotle, who articulates virtues as internal habits of character and excellence that enables human beings to flourish and support civic life. And Plato too showed genuine moral knowledge could be acquired only after a long process of transformation that's not just cognitive, but it awakens a love of the good. Augustine too understood the centrality of the affective, feeling, emotional dimension in ethics as a matter of rightly ordered love. And as Stephen Garber notes, Augustine saw the end of education as character formation. And so as we begin to read biblical narratives of character such as Moses, we can see the way in which these characters that we talk about in our classrooms can help shape the lives of students as they too get inspired and encouraged by the stories that we tell, the narratives we tell, and the characters that they look to in both their strengths and their weaknesses through the Old and the New Testament and through history and in our lives and the lives all around us. Stories with character are important to us. They give us role models. Character imitation reminds us that as we read, our characters that we read about influence us. That is, our mind is looking for models in which to model our life journey upon, to model our values upon, to model our ethics on. And this takes us back to Genesis chapter 1, where we're reminded that humanity is created in God's image and good. In Genesis 2, we're reminded that people are formed by God and relational. God gives us companions. But in Genesis 3 there, we see that there's a fallen nature to humanity that requires redemption and restoration, both at times of momentous change and commitment in the life journey, but also through the day-to-day development of habits and growth through all of our life. So when we look at characters in fiction, we can see that there is direct characterization when we're told something about the characters, and then there's indirect characterization where their actions or their words tell us something about them. And a flat character will have simple, uniform, always the same characterization, and often in the writing of a narrative, you'll see that some characters are fairly flat. That is, they're more background characters. They're not the major characters that we're wrestling with questions about. And then there's the more dynamic and well-rounded and more developed characters that are changing over time, that are wrestling over time with good and evil. Thomas Jenkins, in his book, says that our lenses for interpretation of character are often shaped by the Western societies and cultures that we live in. That is, when we read scripture or read other stories, we often come with preconceptions as to who and what we're looking for. Many of us are looking for happy stories, and we're trying to avoid the less happy stories. Others, of course, are caught up into particular narratives like romances or humor or tragedies or on the edge of your seat, suspense. There's different narratives that appeal to each one of us, and we don't want to be like everyone that we read about, but we do want to be stimulated by the narrative and story And the society and culture that we live in shapes some of the ways in which we see some characters as good and bad, and some characters as worth emulating more than others. And different subcultures too can value certain characters more than others. And you might be able to think in contemporary society about certain subcultural groups that have certain value for certain types of people. Christian Dumez, in the book Jesus and John Wayne, provides a sweeping revisionist history of the last 75 years, particularly in white evangelicalism, in which we see Jesus as described as ruggedly masculine, linking to with Christian nationalism. And as one modern chaplain said, Jesus is often seen as the spiritual badass of today. Evangelical books, films, music, clothing, merchandise often shape the beliefs of millions, and often they promote the value of those who are rugged, soldier-like people like Oliver North, Ronald Reagan, Mel Gibson, Duck Dynasty. They assert white masculine power. And so we've got to ask, is this the best way to read? Is this the best way to see the characters that we emulate and focus on? Or are there other ways? And to recognize that in any church or in any class, there's a variety of people from a variety of backgrounds, people of different ages. There are men and women, younger and older, people from different cultures. We need to recognize and value all of the different cultures that we're a part of, rather than just promoting one narrow aspect of Western culture. As we read about certain characters in literature and in the Bible, as we sit in our Western world armchairs and read, Thomas Jenkins says, our lenses for interpretation and character are often pre-shaped for us. And so the prominent literary styles of our time, he says, such as neoclassical or sentimental characterizations, they have substantial intellectual and social support in particular nations such as America or other Western nations. But we have to be careful of the baggage that they present to us. And you can read more in Thomas Jenkins' The Character of God, Recovering the Lost Literary Power of American Protestantism. And for those at Christian Heritage College, you can read to this book online through Christian Heritage College Library. Many theologians, liberal and conservative, follow these neoclassical sentimental styles of characterization. Much preaching follows this particular approach to characterization, and they highlight biblical passages that are seen to convey the image that they are presenting here. As Noel Porter acknowledged, aspects of Hamlet's character that seem unintelligible or offensive, people today can see the same in the characterization that is being presented. Conservatives, for their part, have often given up on modern literatures, particularly the early part of the 20th century, apart from C.S. Lewis and a few other Christian writings. But then in more recent times, we've seen the growth of Christian literature as well. There's an irony here that the difficulties that liberals and conservatives have with certain romantic characterizations were related to the difficulty they've had since the early 19th century of reconciling their different characterizations with a knowledge of God and the Bible. And one of the points that Jenkins makes here is that how you think of God, how you think of Jesus, how you think of major characters that we look up to in the Bible and how we communicate this one to another can often shape the ways in which we frame values for ourselves and for the organizations that we're a part of. Take time to reflect on the question of the challenge presented to Christian educators as to how can various characters be presented from literatures, from different media and from the Bible to encourage a more healthy student engagement for their own character development. Theology and talk about God is so widely assumed to be boring, some have said, that it's easy to take the dullness for granted. But should this be? Why should the discourse that deals with one of the most interesting, important, perhaps even strangest characters imaginable, God and Jesus, become tedious and dull? Stanley Howes says, God knows it's hard to make God boring, but American Christians and other Christians, often aided and abetted by theologians, have accomplished that feat. They've made one of the most interesting persons that we could relate to, God himself, Jesus, boring. For American and Australian Protestant theology, a large part of the answer to why God is depicted as boring has to do with characterizations of God, God's emotions or lack of emotions, vagueness, obscurity, and dullness in the ways in which God is described. And back to Thomas Jenkins in his book, The Character of God, he says that many depictions of God are flat, emotionally singular, that theologies that are presented have a dullness and boring character to them. Robert Alto argues that the Bible's sparse portrayal of characters is in fact an educational device. It creates scope for a variety of possible interpretations that can be helpful, but at times if we put in our own stereotypes into these interpretations, this is not as helpful. So the model object literary character that we present, whether it be God or Jesus, we need to be careful that we're open to the different ways in which God and Jesus can be understood, that we're open to the mystery even about God and Jesus, and that we shouldn't at times be overconfident and over-definite that we fully know all about God and Jesus, in that we could be leading people astray and we could be sharing a more limited understanding of God and Jesus than they actually are. In fact, anytime we present literature and a depiction of a character, they're going to be simplified to some degree, objectified to some degree, and to some degree less than they really are. Every character in literature to some degree is radically different from the flesh and blood human beings who have subjective agency and free choice, who are quite complicated. And the chances are, if you feel you fully understood God, then you probably haven't fully understood him. If you fully understood the love and grace and compassion of God towards us, again, it's likely that we've not fully understood the immensity of his love and grace and compassion towards us. Character is an artificial construct called into existence by the writer in the literature, introduced and sustained exclusively by means of a set of semiotic procedures and operations. And any adequate theory of literary character formulated in possible world semantics will have to take into account the underlying differences in mode of existence and features between the actual and the non-actual human individuals that we describe. So it's important to consider the ontological perspective that there is a difference between the literary character that is presented and the real character that is being depicted, in that we can never fully describe every word, every thought, every aspect of any character that we write about. We live in a world of the known and the unknown and the only partly known, and it's wise to admit that even though we know much, we know so little about our world, about each other, about the characters that we interact with, or even about ourselves. And one of the great challenges of Christian literature and our reading of the Bible is to develop tools needed to engage more fully with our world, the known and the unknown, the partly known, ourselves, good and evil and potential and possibility, through the literatures and through the core literature of the Bible and the ways in which we read and communicate and share it. We need to recognise the diversity of people listening as we present these literatures. And again, that's one of the reasons why the Bible at times doesn't have all of the details and at times have different viewpoints presented to us in order to challenge the reader to think more broadly and to be open to the realities before us rather than being confined to our own views of ourselves. The Bible challenges us to come humbly before God and to look to God and the reality that we know so little about him and his goodness and his plans for us and the extent of those plans. The Bible and other Christian literatures can help us and our stories to engage more fully with the big questions of existence, particularly when we come humbly to these literatures. It can help us to engage more fully with questions as to what is real, what is true, what is good. How do we know something is true or not true? And what are the conditions that govern how well we know whether something's true or not true, that govern the limits of our knowledge? How do we decide what's the right thing to do? When should we do it? What is beautiful? What is valuable? In looking at the narrative in Exodus, we see Moses himself wrestling with some of these big questions, and it challenges us to wrestle with the big questions. In looking at Exodus and Moses, we see that there are sometimes deficiencies in understanding Moses and the characterization presented there, but we're reminded that there can be limits to our understanding of God. And like Moses, we can say to God, who shall I say has sent me? Who is God who is presented to me? And how does our understanding of God shape our thinking and our lives and our sense of mission and purpose for our lives? Because it's as we think of God and about God, as we think about ultimate reality, that we will make plans for our lives and for what we're going to do in the life journey. You can find out more about some of these challenges by reading Yuri Mogulin's Introducing and Sustaining Characters in Literary Narrative, a Set of Conditions. And you can think about some of the ways in which these insights can be applied in Scripture. But I also encourage you to think more deeply about the ways in which these insights can be applied in your own life and the ways in which they can be applied in your communication and teaching and sharing with others. The book of Exodus, the narrative of Moses, the characterization of Moses, challenges to think more deeply about the ways in which narratives and stories shape our lives and our thinking and that which we value. And it also challenges to think more deeply about our understandings of God and our openness to listening to and engaging with a God who is much bigger than we often imagine, who's much greater than we often think, and a God who's more interested in us and our lives and transformation and change for good in our lives than we often are open to. Thank you.